inspiration for this story came from a moment when I was in Bookman's watching my young children run around, and I found a copy of an old Ripley's Believe It or Not book that caught my eye. And there was an old black and white photograph in that book of something very strange and unusual that I could not get out of my head. And a month, maybe several months passed, and I was in Samantha Ruckman's creative writing class at NAU, and we had a writing prompt, and that image just was in my head, and I just had to get it out. So that was kind of the inspiration for this story. The story is called A Sting About Midline. Shep had a headache. All day, the pain increased while he busied himself in his workshop. At first, it was merely a fluidy pressure, like a pimple forming deep in the skin, too deep to pop. But by lunchtime, the sensation had spread to the left rear quarter panel of his skull. Shep tramped into his house from the workshop, removed his boots, and swept his beanie off his graying hair. "Shit," he hissed out as his fingers grazed the sore spot on his head. He probed tentatively and felt a lifted dome of swollen scalp, like the profile of a slightly rotten apple. Concerned about a possible infection, Shep peered into his bathroom mirror, twisting his neck and parting his hair, but saw only that beneath the follicles his skin was a bit red. Distracted, he prepared lunch for himself in his kitchen while he considered what he should do. Go to the doctor? That would mean a 55-mile drive to Wolf Butte, the closest town with a clinic. The weather wasn't too bad, but it wasn't too good either. Blowing snow could whip across the empty wheat fields and cause rolling whiteouts on the highway. And all the truckers headed to the Canadian border would be on the same road trying to skirt the winter storm, slowly chugging its way east and set to hit Flaxville within the next 12 hours. Shep mumbled a dissenting noise in his throat. He sat down with his sandwich and reached for a napkin from the neat pile in the center of his table. As he spread the square in his lap, his fingers felt the ridges of blue plaid stitching thicker than the white cotton background. This made him think of Lil. He sighed. There were only 3 napkins left of 3 dozen she had bought for him. Ridiculous, really. What a lifelong bachelor like him had needed 3 dozen cloth napkins for, he had not figured out. He picked up his sandwich and took a bite. The pain in his head worsened with chewing. Something crunched in his mouth, and he realized that while distracted and mixing up his tuna, he must have chopped a pickle in. And Lil, of course, came to his mind again. In 50-something years, he had never added a pickle to his tuna salad. Lil had a habit of trying to liven things up for him. The first time he had invited her over to his place for lunch, she had immediately and without question taken over the food prep. She had opened 2 cans of tuna, using a glass to press the freed lid into the fish and force all the oil out. She had chopped in onion and added far too much pepper. "What other spices do you have?" she had asked, looking through his kitchen cabinets. "Spices?" he had shrugged. "What do I need spices for? Not like I'm cooking Indian curry here. Good old salt and pepper takes care of me." She had smiled and turned back to mix pickles and mayo into the bowl. He watched the skin on the backs of her elbows pucker and smooth as her arms worked. "Shep, there are a lot of exotic experiences in this world that I think you may have missed out on so far, spices being the least of them." Shep took another bite and again crunched on a pickle. The brine roused him from his memories, and he frowned at the sandwich. He couldn't decide if he liked pickles in his tuna salad. They made his tongue fidgety. He tipped his head back to take a swig of milk, but winced. The movement had caused the lump on his head to shoot with pain. He peeled the slices of bread apart and glared at the orangey mush inside. "They say tuna is full of mercury," he muttered to himself. They also said that mercury could cause birth defects. He wondered if it could cause head defects. With a sigh, he trashed the remnants of the sandwich and swallowed an ibuprofen. He went back to work, but within an hour, the tender lump began to throb, then developed a sting about midline. He gave up on his woodworking project for the day. In his house, Shep sat on an old plastic lawn chair beside the washer and dryer. He bent to unlace his boots, but hissed out a sudden exhalation when he felt a tearing sensation where the sting was. It seemed like sweat was crawling through his hair. Shep slipped his fingers under his hat, and they came away moist with ichor. In the bathroom again, he struggled to find an angle where he might see the now weeping sore in the mirror. He resorted to bringing in the chrome toaster to try and catch the reflection, but the appliance was too scratched to do any good. Again, he thought of Lil, Though actually it was her hairbrush he missed this time. Though they had been too practical and too old to move in together, she had kept a few things in his bathroom drawer. Some sweet-smelling hand soap, a toothbrush, and a hairbrush with a little mirror on the handle. He opened the drawer. It had been empty for 6 months. Shep woke the next morning to the sight of snowflakes as big as $50 clotting the air outside his bedroom window, and his hair crusted to the side of his head. He glanced down and was alarmed to find that his pillow had yellowish rings overlapped across the fabric where the sore had seeped in the night. In the kitchen, he bent over the sink, his left hand awkward with the spray nozzle of the faucet. He shot himself in the ear before getting the aim right. About an inch above and behind his ear, that's where the pain was. He figured he should clean it, whatever it was, so he used a dollop of shampoo, lathered and rinsed again, and probed with his fingers. The throbbing seemed more intense than yesterday, as if it had taken on a bass note, and the skin was open in a spot about as big as the tip of a finger. He folded one of the cloth napkins from the table into a thick square, held it against his head, and settled into his recliner near the TV. His fingers absently plucked at the buttons of the TV remote, but he didn't turn it on. Instead, he reached for his phone. He dialed Lil's number, his right thumb jabbing the buttons without even thinking about the digits. Shep and Lil's friendship had been carrying on pleasantly for 8 months when the daughter called. What was her name? Damn, that was something that had always bugged Lil when Shep couldn't remember her kids' names. He squinted as he listened to the ringtone. Courtney, that was it, and the grandson, his name was Cord. The phone in his hand continued to ring. 8 months into their friendship, Courtney had called her mother crying. Cord, who was little, maybe 4, had been diagnosed with autism, and Courtney needed help. He had been through all the preschools and daycares that their town had to offer, and there was nowhere left to take him. Courtney and her husband had to work. Lil had been silent for a day, and then she had asked Shep what he thought she should do. Should she leave Flaxville, move so that she could help Courtney? They needed help, and Lil was a helper. Lil's voicemail picked up. Hello, you've reached the voicemail of Lilith DeRay. I'm away from my phone, hopefully doing something fun like learning to tango. More likely, Cord has just dumped my phone in the toilet again, but either way, leave me a message and I'll get back to you. Her perky message usually made Shep smile, but today it made something clench just under the curled edges of his ribs. When Lil had asked for his input, Shep was strangely irritated. He told her to make up her own mind. It was her family, after all. He figured he didn't need to argue his own personal case for her staying. Hiya, Lil, just Shep here. It's snowing. Flakes as big as dinner plates, you'd love it. Anyway, well, all is well here. I'll call you back later. Shep sat still, pressing the napkin to his scalp. He picked up the receiver of the phone again, and his thumb hovered over the redial button. He set the phone back in its cradle. As Shep brushed his teeth and shaved, he took stock of the rest of his body, reasoning that if the lump on his head was something serious, he'd probably have other symptoms too. He looked closely at his face as he scraped the razor under his chin. His face wasn't puffy or swollen. The left side seemed to be symmetric to the right. Fingers pressed under his jaw found that his glands felt normal, no fever. Outside, the new snow had added a good 6 inches to what was already hard on the ground, and the sky was solid as an iron door, no signs of letting up for hours at least. Shep shoveled the path to his workshop. He shoveled the short stretch of drive behind his truck. He shoveled a curved swath in front of the mailbox in case the plows didn't make it till tomorrow. He was sweating under his beanie, but he didn't know if taking it off and exposing his open flesh to the cold was a good idea. He wished Lil had answered. After an hour and a half, he called a break. In his kitchen, he peeled down to his shorts, t-shirt, and socks and stood rolling sausage links around in a skillet, listening to the radio. His head throbbed to his heartbeat. And so, you were in the Congo doing relief work. The host of the Bozeman radio talk show was interviewing a guest. Yes, we were introducing solar ovens to the local people, plastic contraptions that focus the heat of the sun to cook with. Shep had taken to listening to this show called Knowledge Unwound with Lil. She loved the more exotic stories of international explorers studying things like Arctic ice or mummies from the Andes. She would sigh at the end of each show and say, "So many mysteries still out there. Don't you wish sometimes that we could unravel a mystery?" Shep would smile. but he was a content man. Well, your philanthropic work was no doubt fascinating, the radio host was chuckling, but you're here today to talk about a little friend you acquired while overseas. The woman laughed too. Friend might be stretching it, though I guess I bore a weird affection for it when it was all over with. Shep listened as he lifted out the sausage to drain on paper towels. And by it, you mean a botfly. Shep paused as he plated 2 fried eggs. He eyed their jiggling yolks, wondering if he should turn off the show. So, you're out in the jungle trying to help people cook their food so they can avoid bacteria and parasites, but then you are attacked by a parasite of your own? I wasn't attacked exactly. The woman settled into a teacherly rhythm. The botfly has evolved a very clever reproductive procedure. They use mosquitoes as the middlemen. Shep sat down at the table, listening hard, something about the story distracting him from the pain in his head. The woman explained that botflies lay their eggs on mosquitoes. The mosquitoes bite a mammal to drink their blood, and the tiny botfly eggs fall into the wound created by the mosquito's proboscis. And you were unlucky enough to have one of these contaminated mosquitoes bite you, the host announced. I had no idea that this had happened to me, the woman said. I thought I had a mosquito bite, but it got bigger, a big lump that seemed infected right on the top of my head. Shep paused in mid-chew. And it turns out, the host prompted, it turns out I had a botfly larva living and growing in my scalp. Shep's fork clattered to the floor. It only took Shep 15 minutes to get to the library, though it was clear across the little town, and he walked. Due to school being canceled with the weather, the library was packed with kids and noisy, despite the librarian, Kimberly, constantly shushing everyone. Shep set the encyclopedia that he had been reading down and felt the nausea in his gut subside by degrees. There were no such botflies in Montana. As a matter of fact, botflies needed hot, humid weather to survive, jungle weather, certainly not cold winter weather. He sat at an oak study cubicle and watched the kids buzz around him. A knot of 10-year-old boys hanging out in an aisle between 2 bookshelves marked with a sign that read, "Graphic Novels." He gently fingered the lump on the side of his head. It was definitely getting bigger. He heaved himself to his feet, ready to leave, but he stopped by the front desk first. "Hey, Kimberly," he said by way of greeting. The young woman had short, dark hair tinted blue at the tips and a diamond stud in her right nostril. Lil probably would have liked it, he thought, though such adornment made him uncomfortable. "Hi there, Mr. Olson. Got anything to check out?" "Nope," Shep shook his head. "I just thought you might want to know there's a bunch of young boys checking out some kind of graphic novels." Kimberly frowned, but then her eyes lit up. "Oh," she laughed, "that's okay. They're not bad graphic, they're just illustrated graphic. You know, glorified comic books?" Shep cocked his head. He didn't know. Sometimes he felt like the world was changing at a pace he had no hope of comprehending, never mind keeping up with. He liked things old-fashioned. Shep's eyes focused on the large magnifying glass on a swiveling stand that sat at one end of Kimberly's desk. "Kimberly, can I ask you a favor?" Shep stopped at the drugstore on the way home and purchased some gauze and a tube of antibiotic ointment. Kimberly was no Lil, but her advice was all that he had to go on. The poor girl had sounded a bit ill when she examined Shep's head with her magnifying glass. It looks like there is something hard in the sore." She had donned latex gloves, the kind she used to handle the few antique books in the little library's collection. She gingerly parted Shep's hair. He had bent awkwardly over her desk, staring at a few kids who stared back at him. "Did you fall, Shep? It looks almost like there's a pebble or something stuck in your head." Now, Shep washed his hands at his sink, then dabbed some ointment on. He could feel the pebble. It was starting to protrude. Shep wrapped a couple lengths of gauze around his scalp, then bundled himself up in a throw blanket on the couch. He was beginning to feel shivery. He glanced out his living room window, but the view was blank. Nothing but swirls of gray shifting amongst themselves. The window screen puffed back onto the glass occasionally with a small tapping sound. Shep flicked his TV on, happy to see the cable was still working. He tried not to think about the darkness outside, nearly as dark as night. Shep dreamed. The blizzard lasted 3 days. Shep awoke from his dreaming after one. He had plenty of food stockpiled. He'd always been the kind of guy to be prepared. Canned hash, canned potatoes, canned spinach, dry pancake batter, and cornmeal. The blizzard kept him from his projects, kept him quiet and settled down in the house. The phone and cable had gone out while he dreamed, but these things didn't bother him. Instead, he came to appreciate that the storm forced him to focus on his new state, forced him to get used to it awful quick. Shep had grown a horn. At least, it started growing during the blizzard, but it continued to grow for several weeks afterwards. When he had first awoken, his neck and back racked with pain as his body wrestled with this thing emerging from his skull, he had been frightened. He had gripped the tip of it, slick with juices, and tried to yank it out. He had tried pliers, but it was solid. It wasn't just growing from his skull, it was his skull. He had paced back and forth in his underwear, blubbering like a baby, alternately trying to freeze it away with ice packs or chisel it away with kitchen tools. He had thought about trying to get into his workshop where he had his saws, but the expanse of drifting snow, enough to lose a careless man in, had quieted his terror. Strange sounds had been echoing through his waking hours, creating a soundtrack to this new life, a soundtrack that featured glacial grinds and gravelly pops as the keratin curled from his head. It grew close to his scalp, the tip reaching out like a slow finger, finding the topography of his head and adapting to it. It began an inch above and behind his left ear, but it grew steadily forward with an upward angle at first, then dipping to curl back into itself without breaching his hairline. It kept itself mostly hidden. The blizzard allowed Shep to think many thoughts about his new situation. And over the coming weeks, he continued to think, why was he growing a horn? Was there some spiritual significance to it? Shep considered himself a God-fearing man, though not overly religious. He made sure to attend services on holidays. He could just picture the ladies who were always conspicuously present before Mass, gold-rimmed glasses held in place with little chains about their necks, fingering their prayer beads. No doubt they would associate the horn with Satan, decrying Shep as fallen, or, more excitingly, a product of bestiality. Shep fingered the growth as he considered this. There was something satisfying about tugging on it and feeling the solidness of its roots, like a kid testing a tooth that was going nowhere soon. He decided there was nothing sinful about it. Was a cow or a deer evil due to their horns? Ridiculous. Of course, it could be a strange manifestation of a medical condition, a cancerous tumor of some sort. But when Shep could finally see it in the mirror and stared at its lengthening profile each day, the words cancer and tumor were the furthest things from his mind. The horn was substantial. Eventually, it became impressive. And less than a month from the time he had felt that first pain, it became beautiful. The horn, his horn, it surpassed everything Shep had ever experienced. Objectively, he would say it looked something like the horn of a ram, a Rocky Mountain bighorn. It was robust, thick enough at the base that his hand could barely encircle it. Yet it seemed lithe in its curl, its arch, the instinctive way it hugged his head, so that under a winter hat, no one noticed it at all. The texture fascinated his hands, the graduated rings and ridges of growth. He could barely keep himself from playing with it, stroking it. Careful, he told himself, or you'll go blind. The old adage made him chuckle. He used to sweat those things as a boy, used to think that enjoying his body was carnal, animalistic. But now he started to second-guess those ideas, now that his body was becoming more animalistic. Shep had been a bachelor till Lil had happened into his life, but he hadn't been a virgin. He made monthly pilgrimages north across the border to a pink and black striped compound on a dirt road in the Canadian prairie. Shep had always felt a mix of relief and guilt after each visit. But now the horn made him wonder why. The human body was capable of amazing things. Why not explore them all? The winter wore on, and Shep noticed that people seemed to be treating him differently. As he went about the humdrum business of small-town life, as he rolled his grocery carts down aisles or pumped his gas or filled his nail bags at the hardware store, he realized that people were more friendly, more smiles were aimed in his direction. At first he felt panicky, thought that someone must have discovered his secret. Perhaps Kimberly had put two and two together at the library and started a rumor. Perhaps the thick trapper hat that he wore everywhere was becoming suspicious. But eventually he realized that people were more friendly because he was. He carried his head proudly, despite the fact that it was a bit unbalanced now. He had wondered if a second horn would grow, but so far it was singular. And he cradled the idea of it in his heart and thought that he had the tiniest inkling of what a parent must feel. A thing had been created by his body, a thing that was beautiful. He finally understood the meaning of the word precious. And yet that word was nearly his undoing. Shep was at the utility office paying his bills when he ran into Sue. Sue was the woman who, for the last dozen years, had cut Shep's hair. "Oh my goodness, if it isn't Shep Olson, honey. I was just talking to Melissa Cartwright the other day. You remember she had that bad permanent I had to fix the last time you were scheduled for a trim? I was just talking to her, and we were both wondering where the heck you had been, because you know..." She reached up and fingered the curling locks that were jutting below the hem of his hat. "I haven't seen you in months, and I can see you are more than due for a visit." Sue had always taken Shep's breath away with her ability to talk, but now he was breathless from wondering. If there was anyone in town who could, no, would notice the new shape to his head, it was this woman. "Darling, look at you!" She clucked her tongue behind her lips and shook her bleached head. "Are you going for a retro hippie look all of a sudden? Think a longer do will impress the ladies?" She gave a hearty laugh, which shook her belly fat in her tight sweater. Suddenly, Shep realized that he had a choice. He could lie, he could make up a story and then try for the rest of his life to avoid this sharp-eyed woman, this town matron and patron of gossip. Or he could show her. She continued to chat as Shep considered this startling prospect. Up until that moment, he had kept his secret tight, kept the horn hidden like a man who had found a gold nugget in the local park. It was his, damn it, despite the fact that he sometimes wondered if he had an obligation to reveal it, to show it to people, for posterity, for humanity, to let people know that it was okay to recognize in themselves a connection to the natural world, to exist a little more in their skins, in their bones, to recognize that they were all a little animal somewhere, that inside of themselves, in their cells and their appendages, and the places they touched the ground and the air, they were precious. Sue understood the importance of bodily accessory, of the cut and curl of that which grew from the head. Shep's hand reached up. His fingers slid under the mouflon lining of the thick trapper's hat. He gripped the edge of it where it rested on his forehead. His arm braced above, ready to pull the lip back, to expose his horn like a newly hatched bird, wet with birth, wet with the sweat of a too-warm hat in spring. Another woman walked out of the utility office behind him. She strode right past. Shep saw her framed by the crook of his raised elbow, and that was when Sue hissed. "Oh, did you see that? That was Leslie Parker. Do you know her? Oh, of course you don't, because you are not the kind of a man to know a tramp. She is pregnant. See that bump of a belly? Pregnant for sure. But her husband had testicular cancer 5 years ago. They're still married, so how do you suppose she got that bump?" No, Sue was not the woman to reveal his precious secret to. He glanced at Leslie Parker, and he felt glad for her. Shep climbed into his pickup truck and headed home. His hands shook with the thing that had almost happened. To distract himself, he punched his radio on. "Good morning, Montana, and welcome to Knowledge Unwound." Shep suddenly realized what should have been so obvious all along. He had something precious to share with someone precious. He parked his truck in his drive and stripped his hat off. The horn nearly jumped with joy as it felt a cooling breeze bubble over its ridges, brushing the moisture of sweat up and away. Shep climbed his steps, strode through the living room, and grabbed the phone. His thumb punched the numbers without a thought, and he spoke boldly into the silence after the beep. "Lil, it's Shep. Lil, I've got something to show you, to share with you. I miss you, Lil. I miss you. And I should have told you that before. He grinned into the phone and slid his fingers lightly along his horn. Lil, I've got something amazing here. Life is just so amazing. Lil, you're gonna like this mystery. Thank you.